Okay, guys, so since we didn't really have time this week to do any notes in class because I was sick, we're going to try to do some of the notes here on Edmodo this weekend and early next week. So we're going to look at the 1920s mostly for this. We might get into a little bit of the 1930s in one of the later videos. Okay, so first thing we're going to look at is women's rights. Now, most of us, we read a story in E-Period about Susan B. Anthony and her struggle for women's suffrage. Now, that was about 50 years before women actually were granted the right to vote. And that was in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Okay, so the 19th Amendment is passed, and it basically gave women the right to vote. So there was no more debate about whether women could or could not vote, and whether or not the 13th, 14th, or the 14th or 15th Amendment applied to them. And women who would have been in favor of women's suffrage and women's rights were called flappers. They were kind of women that dressed different from most women at the time. They were kind of a little bit of a counterculture movement. I'll show you a picture of what a typical flapper looked like here in a second. But they challenged traditional behavior of women, traditional look of how women were supposed to look at the time too. So there's some flappers. They typically wore shorter dresses, cut their hair short, wore their makeup a certain way, kind of actually tried to look a little bit boyish. So looked very different from the typical woman in the 1920s. Okay, so along the same time, there was something called the Red Scare, and it was basically due to a lot of union and labor strikes. Basically, if the workers didn't feel like they were being treated fairly or working in safe conditions, they would strike and ask for better conditions, ask for better pay, or a variety of things. And so people throughout the United States started to be concerned that the people that were leading these strikes were communists or anarchists, and they were trying to influence the United States, changing up the old status quo of how things have always been, that kind of thing. And so people were really afraid of these changes that were happening. And part of this fear is due to some immigration that's going on. At the same time that these strikes are going on, there is an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europeans, a lot of the countries, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the countries, especially Russia, were communist, and people here in the United States were basically out of ignorance afraid and did not like foreigners because they thought they were communists or anarchists, and they were coming here to start these strikes and to start problems and to cause massive change in the United States. So there's a lot of xenophobia, a lot of fear and hatred of foreigners. This kind of comes to a head with the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. There was a robbery, and basically within a very short amount of time, Sacco and Vanzetti, two fairly recent immigrants, were executed for the crime, and it's basically since been proven that they were not guilty, and it was a case of severe xenophobia. And the ACLU was kind of getting a good start at this point, and they were trying to back up and help Sacco and Vanzetti and stand up for them. So there's just some political cartoons from the time. So this is a weird picture. This is Sacco and Vanzetti, but you always hear about them being Sacco and Vanzetti, and you always see this picture. This is Vanzetti, this is Sacco. It's always backwards. It's kind of weird. Okay, Great Migration. So after obviously slavery ends, the African Americans that are in the South are a lot of them are stuck on the plantations that they were serving on as slaves, but they're now sharecroppers, which you guys have been reading about. Those of you that have read Gloryfield with Miss Hamby. But at this time, because there's a massive amount of industrialization, remember the video we watched in class talked about the discovery of oil and how that changed the economy of the United States. Well, there was a lot of industrial jobs, and so African Americans realized that they could move north and leave those places that they had their families had served as slaves on, and move to get a fairly good, reliable, good-paying job in one of the factories. And so they moved north, and they were hoping that there would be a lot less segregation and prejudice and hatred for them in the North. And what they came to find out is that basically there were people that were already working the jobs that they were hoping to get, and there was a lot of competition, and so the racial problems that existed here in the South continued to exist and kind of perpetuated in the North because of competition for jobs. And with this competition, there's a lot of violence. Anytime that there's somebody that's trying to take your job, or you think there might be somebody trying to take your job, or anything like that, there's a lot of fear, and fear breeds hatred, and hatred breeds violence. And so there was a lot of race riots in the 1920s throughout the North. Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, basically any of the big industrial centers where they had a lot of manufacturing jobs. Some typical routes, you can see a lot of people from this area would have moved up the eastern seaboard. People from the deep south, Mississippi, Alabama, would have moved to the Midwest. And then out in Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas moved a little bit more further into the Midwest. Okay, 1920s politics. This is a time of a lot of corruption. Warren Harding was elected president in 1920. He was kind of a part of the Ohio gang, which was basically a lot of corruption. Out in Wyoming, there was a big scandal about oil, oil discovery, and basically the money was, it was a really messed up scandal where basically the government was supporting this company, and this company was supporting the government, and basically it ensured that this company was going to get the oil, and basically everybody was lining their pockets at the cost of, everyone else. So Harding dies in 1923, and Calvin Coolidge takes over. His nickname was Closed Mouth Cal. He did not do a whole lot of speeches. One thing that they did do, though, is kind of disarm. They limited military weapons and kind of led us back to isolationism. And they signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact that basically outlawed war. And so we were back to isolationism. Okay. Hoover was elected president in 1928, and basically these guys were Hoover was Republican, and they were very pro-business, and they kind of thought that if business was allowed to control everything, that everything would be for the best of the people. There's kind of the idea of supply and demand, and it didn't really work out that well for them. Okay. And like I said, the country did become isolationist again. So here's a picture of the presidents at the time. Hooray. Okay, Prohibition. We've talked about this in class. Prohibition was the 18th Amendment and basically banned alcohol sale, manufacture in the United States, and that kind of stuff. And so alcohol became illegal, but the problem is that it led to a lot of crime. Speakeasies were illegal clubs, bars that sold alcohol. They were secret. You couldn't get into them just by walking in the door. You kind of had to know someone who knew someone, or you had to know the secret passage or something like that. Bootleggers were smugglers that were making alcohol. Here in North Carolina, up in Virginia, there was a lot of people that were moonshine runners, and that's kind of where NASCAR comes from. They souped up their cars, like in that video that we saw last week, or this week, I should say. They souped up their cars to be able to get away from the police, and everyone bragged about how fast their cars were, and soon enough, they started racing each other, and lo and behold, we have NASCAR today. And it led to the rise of enormous criminal organizations. They said at one point Al Capone was making $1,500 a minute. Okay, it's astronomical amount of money that these guys were making off of selling alcohol and manufacturing it illegally, bringing it in from Canada, all that kind of stuff. And so they were hoping that because there was a lot of violence due to alcohol before this time, they were hoping that if they outlawed it, that it would, reduce the violence. But what happened is it actually had the opposite effect. Imagine that. And it made the cities even more violent. And so after a few years, basically, the 21st Amendment's passed, and it ends prohibition, and alcohol is again legal in the United States. So here's some pictures. It's one of the access to a basement below a bar, or below a building. It's Al Capone. This is a St. Valentine's Day massacre that you guys saw in that video that we watched earlier this week. Okay, so culture wars. So at this time, the people that are leading the charge against alcohol were typically women's groups and Christian groups, and they were fundamentalists. They believed that the Bible is literally true and free of error. There was a lot of debate at the time whether or not evolution should be taught in schools, and so there was a lot of debate about, the how man became man, basically whether or not it was creation or evolution. And so there's a big debate and trial in Tennessee over whether or not it should be taught as basically from the viewpoint of the Bible or the viewpoint of evolution. Also at the same time, there was a lot of nativism. We talked about xenophobia, and xenophobia and nativism kind of go hand in hand. It's basically against immigration. And in 1921, because of nativism and xenophobia, the United States government limited immigration to 375,000 people a year, which sounds like a lot, but really it was not that many. And also later on in the 20s, they passed the National Origins Act, which basically limited the amount of immigrants that could come in from certain countries, but allowed a lot more immigrants from European countries. So it kind of limited people from Asia and from other areas. This is a picture of the Scopes trial about evolution. Okay, so the 1920s are often called boom times because there's so much growth and economic development during the time. We talked about this in class, how they discovered oil and it led to massive amounts of industrialization. Henry Ford really takes off this time and made the cars much more affordable to people through mass production and through assembly lines, and basically made it so that everyone could afford a car. And like I said, mass production leads to a lot of growth and opportunities for businesses. And this is the kind of the beginning of credit. So like if you wanted to a Ford dealership and you couldn't afford to buy one with cash, they would basically give you an option to do an installment plan where you'd pay each month. And it's kind of like leads us to what we have today as like credit cards and loans and that kind of thing. So there's some pictures for you. Model T, old school, kind of cool. My grandpa always thought it'd be kind of cool to own one. I never did. Alright, Jazz Age, real quick. Hooray. There's a lot of fads. You guys read about this in class while I was gone. Some of the things that the fads were flappers, marathon dancing. The people basically danced as long as they could. And flagpole sitting. You climb up to the top of a flagpole or a telephone pole and sit on it. It's kind of ridiculous. In 1920, radio really takes off. You would have sat around the radio with your family and listened to basically kind of like what were sitcoms at the time, but they were on the radio. And movies really start to take off. Nickelodeons, because they cost a nickel to go see. They were early theaters. Later on, in the later 20s, they started with talkies because they could record sound. And the first movie with sound is called The Jazz Singer. So there's some photographs. You've got marathon dancers, flagpole sitters, old school radio, and this is the first talkie, the first movie that has sound to it, The Jazz Singer. So I think we'll stop there for this video.